though it was a matter of fact. It was not. Of course it wasn't. Let me explain something. Sexual assaults are a routine part of atrocities during war. It can happen, and it has happened time and time again, which is why there is a likelihood that it could have happened on October 7th. This is a position that I've maintained since October 7th. There were plenty of atrocities that occurred on October 7th, okay, that are akin to acts of terror. Because on October 7th, it wasn't just the Palestinian Brigades, a coalition of resistance forces that includes Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PFLP, DFLP, and many others. It was also, once the barrier into Israel was broken, there was also criminal elements that broke through said barrier. But as far as we saw, given how much of what happened on October 7th was filmed, including the actual real atrocities of Palestinian forces executing civilians, shooting at porta potties and the like during the Nova Festival and many other circumstances, the likelihood that there wasn't firsthand accounts on rampant sexual assault in the way that the original coverage entailed, that didn't meet the muster, like the normal standard of the New York Times reporting. There are some reasons for it, because this was, for all intents and purposes, as far as the Palestinian resistance goes, a operation that was, in their own words, much more successful than they had predicted. They thought that there would be a lot more resistance overall, and that once the dam broke, there was a ton more violence than a quick in and out operation where they would be able to capture some prisoners of war as hostages in an effort to bargain, in an effort to negotiate with the Israeli apartheid regime. In that chaos, there was absolutely a majority of civilians that were slaughtered, executed in their homes when they were going about their daily lives. Inside the newsroom, the article was met with praise from editorial leaders, but skepticism from other Times journalists. The paper's flagship podcast, The Daily, attempted to turn the article into an episode, but it didn't manage to get through a fact check, as Intercept previously reported. If you recall, the daily episode was released and quickly taken off the air because it failed the New York Times' own standards. As the Times faces scrutiny for its coverage of Israel's war on Gaza, it has capitulated to the pro-Israel media watchdog Camera. Camera is another Hasbara operation, but we're not going to get into that right now. They pulled a high-profile episode of its podcast, The Daily, about sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas on October 7 amid a furious internal debate about the strength of the paper's original reporting on the subject. Times newsroom sources told The Intercept the episode had been scheduled for January 9 and was based on a prominent article led by Pulitzer Prize winner Jeffrey Gettleman, claiming that Hamas had systematically used sexual violence as a weapon of war. The fear among Times staffers who had been critical of the paper's Gaza coverage is that Schwartz will become a scapegoat for what is a much deeper failure. She may harbor animosity towards Palestinians, lack the experience with investigative journalism, and feel conflicting pressures between being a supporter of Israel's war effort and a Times reporter. But Schwartz did not commission herself and her nephew to report one of the most consequential stories of the war. Senior leadership at the New York Times. Schwartz said as much in an interview with the Israeli Army radio on December 31st. The New York Times said, "Let's do an investigation into sexual violence. It was more of a case of them having to convince me," she said. Her host cut her off. "It was a proposal of the New York Times, the entire thing?" Unequivocally, obviously, of course," she said. "The paper stood behind us 200% and gave us the time, the investment, the resource to go in depth with this investigation as much as needed." If you recall at the time, by the way, right around the same newspaper publication from the New York Times, Israel was very mad at the UN committee probing Hamas sexual atrocities against Israeli women, calling them and also anti-Semitic. This is a normal part of the process for truth seeking. Why would you go against this investigation by the United Nations? That there is a likelihood of sexual violence that occurred on October 7th. Make no mistake. The fact that they would stand against that, the Israeli government would stand against that, the UN investigation is akin to having Hamas leader investigate the sex crimes himself, is ridiculous. It is ridiculous. You have to understand, in a circumstance where you have been victimized and you want some legal repercussions for the perpetrators, the criminal justice system comes in and they're like, okay, we're going to take a look at this. Like, we are taking allegations very seriously. We are going to conduct an investigation. And you go, no, you hate me. You can't conduct an investigation. You just have to take what I said and immediately do something, which we are doing ourselves. And you should just step aside as we do the thing that we're doing in retaliation. Just remember that. That is incredible, in my opinion. Let's get back to the article by The Intercept. Shortly after the war broke out, some editors and reporters complained that Time standards barred them from referring to Hamas as terrorists. A rationale from the Standards Department, run for 14 years by Philip Corbett, had long been that Hamas was the de facto administrator of a specific territory rather than a stateless terror group. The deliberately killing civilians, went the argument, was not enough to label a group terrorist, as that label could apply quite broadly, including to the United States government and including to Israel, for the record. But the New York Times does not apply that same rigorous standard to all groups. When it comes to foreign policy, the New York Times is a stenographer for the State Department. That much is clear. And that has always been the case. That's why they were championing the lies, the Iraq War that brought us into the Iraq War. They are complacent. I love the New York Times. I think it's a very valuable organ of the media. I think it's a very valuable part of this process. I could not do what I do without mainstream media, without Associated Press, without the journalists. I have friends that work at these outlets. Please make no mistake. I'm not doing a classic like, fake news, mainstream media is fake. I'm not doing that. I'm not saying that at all. Always apply media criticism and also media literacy. I always try to explain to people media literacy. It's like me holding your hand and guiding you through these news articles. The New York Times is not supposed to be a dish rag, but unfortunately, when it comes to channeling narratives that the State Department wants out there, they will absolutely do it. Corbett, after October 7th, defended the policy in the face of pressure, newsroom sources said, but he lost. On October 19th, an email went out on behalf of Executive Director Joe Kahn saying that Corbett had asked to step back from his position. After 14 years as the embodiment of Times standards, Phil Corbett has told us he'd like to step back a bit and let someone else take the leading role in this crucial effort, the Times leadership explained. 3 newsroom sources said that the move was tied to the pressure he was under to soften coverage in Israel's favor. One of the social media posts that Schwartz liked, triggering the Times review, made the case that for Israeli propaganda purposes, Hamas should be likened at all times to the Islamic State. This is a direct carbon copy of not just the American position at the time. It was cultivated and deliberately crafted by the Israeli Foreign Ministry. Hamas is ISIS was a hashtag. Hamas is ISIS, what Israel went along with post-October 7 to justify the genocidal campaign. Ironic considering that they went with Hamas is ISIS and Hamas are Nazis when Israel has, as a matter of fact, with al-Nusra at times, resembles ISIS way closer in nature, both in its colonial endeavors and also its bastardization of religion as though it is a religious purpose that guides them. Just like ISIS, unsuccessfully, to say that they were doing this for Islam, weaponized Judaism in the most nefarious purposes to justify their atrocities. So the point I'm trying to make is that a closer comparison between ISIS would not be with Hamas, a resistance group against the apartheid regime, with Israel, whether it be destruction of archaeological and cultural sites, of an entire population. Since the revelations regarding Schwartz's recent social media activity, her byline has not appeared in the paper and she has not attended editorial meetings. The paper said that a review into her social media likes is ongoing. Those likes are unacceptable violations of our company policy, said a Times spokesperson. The bigger scandal may be the reporting itself, the process that allowed it to print, and the life-altering impact the reporting had for thousands of Palestinians whose deaths were justified by the alleged systematic sexual violence orchestrated by Hamas, the paper claimed to have exposed. Another frustrated Times reporter, who has also worked as an editor there, said, a lot of focus will understandably, rightfully be directed to Schwartz, but this is the most clearly poor editorial decision-making that undermines all the other great work being tirelessly done across the paper. Remember, I have like literal friends at the New York Times that have conducted very good investigations on the visual team and on other aspects of the Times coverage as it pertains to Israel-Palestine. There are people, I'm not going to reveal who they are for obvious reasons, but there are people I talk to almost on a weekly basis about the ongoing issues. They have sources on the ground. It is not the entirety of the paper. In this instance, they absolutely are. The paper is whole cloth engaging in genocide apologia. The Channel 12 podcast interview with Schwartz, which The Intercept translated from Hebrew, opens a window to their controversial story and suggests that the New York Times' mission was to bolster a predetermined narrative. In response to The Intercept's questions about Schwartz's podcast interview, a spokesperson for the New York Times walked back the blockbuster article's framing that evidence shows Hamas had weaponized sexual violence to a softer claim that there may have been systematic use of sexual assault. Times International editor Phil Pan said in a statement that he stands by the work. Mrs. Schwartz was a part of a rigorous reporting and editing process, he said. She made valuable contributions and we saw no evidence of bias in her work. We remain confident in the accuracy of our reporting and stand by the team's investigation. But as we have said, her likes of offensive and opinionated social media posts predating her work with us are unacceptable. After the story was published, Schwartz, who did not respond to a request for comment, tweeted to thank the Times for standing behind the important stories we have published. The recent attacks against me will not deter me from continuing doing my work. Addressing her social media activity, Schwartz said, I understand why people who do not know me were offended by the inadvertent like I pressed on 1070.